Hey there, my name is Megan and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a review for Dune by Frank Herbert. But before we go ahead and get on into the review, if you are not already subscribed to my channel, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button as well as the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I post new bookish content. I post new videos every Monday, Thursday, Saturday, and sometimes other days throughout the week. Also, don't forget to check down in the description box below for links to all of my social media, my Buddy Read Discord, and my Patreon, where you can be entered into winning book giveaways. Before we get on into it, I just want to say that I read this book about 10 years ago, and it was at a time when I was not reading a lot of sci-fi, if any sci-fi, and I struggled through it quite a bit. So I actually, when going into this my second time around, treated it as a new read because I really didn't remember anything from my original read. I found it very confusing. I didn't really understand a lot that was going on, and this time around was a much better experience for me. So I did remember a couple things from my original read, but overall I'm treating this as my first read through of Dune. Dune is a classic sci-fi novel written by American author Frank Herbert, and it was published in 1965. It is the first of 5 novels in this universe. Dune takes place about 20,000 years into the future, where humankind has expanded and colonized different planets in the galaxy. The political system of this galaxy is ruled by an emperor, and there are subsequent dukes that have control over specific planets, and we are following Duke Leto Atreides as he is moving his family from one planet to the desert planet called Arrakis. And with him is his concubine named Jessica, who is the mother of his son Paul, who is 15 years old. Arrakis is a very coveted planet because it is very wealthy in something known as the spice, and the spice is used for a whole bunch of different things, but it is mostly used by other people in the galaxy, like the wealthy people, kind of like a drug, and it is also used to make things, plastics, explosives, and it is also consumed by the indigenous population of Arrakis. Before Duke Leto took over Arrakis, it was run by Baron Vladimir Harkonnen and his family, and these two houses have a lot of contention between them. Eventually, Duke Leto is betrayed by the Harkonnens because they want to kill him, and they go after his son and his concubine, and his son and his concubine, Jessica, actually escape into the desert and are picked up by the Fremen. And the Fremen actually believe that Jessica and her son Paul are fulfilling this prophecy that they, especially Paul, are sent to be the saviors of this people in Arrakis, to save them from the oppressive houses of the Galactic Empire. So now I'm going to talk about the things that I liked in this book. So this book, like I said, was written in 1965, and I feel like for the time period it was written in, the science fiction elements were pretty interesting. The way that our author developed so-called futuristic technology using what we know or knew about science at that time period was well done. So we see influences of like helicopters and atomic bombs and that sort of modern technology woven into this world. One of the things I really liked about this book was the use of the spice and the way that Frank Herbert made it such a big part of this world. And I found the spice really interesting because, like I said, it's an addictive substance, so people around the empire use it. It's also part of the Fremen culture, but it's interesting because it unlocks these like psychedelic abilities almost in people that consume it. So it creates like a heightened sense of awareness. It allows Paul especially to be able to kind of see visions of the future in the past, which plays a lot into him as a character. And I just thought it was an interesting concept and an interesting part of the science fiction aspect of this book. And I feel like if it wasn't a part of the plot and it wasn't something that Frank Herbert included, then the story wouldn't have been nearly as interesting. And I feel like it actually helps Paul as a character be more interesting. This book also brought to the forefront a lot of concepts and themes that were really, really deep and actually really good to discuss. You can see that Frank Herbert definitely used a lot of influences from our history to create his plot. Racism, colonialism, using fear as a tactic to oppress, the role of women in society. So a lot of ideas that we have dealt with throughout our whole history and are still dealing with are present in this book. Now, how Frank Herbert addressed some of them, I'll talk about in a little bit. So I appreciate how he was able to incorporate deeper concepts, deeper themes into this book under the guise as like a sci-fi novel. Another thing I really liked was the character Jessica. In my personal opinion, I felt like she was a much better rounded character than Paul, who is like our main protagonist. The reason that I like Jessica so much is I feel like she had a lot more at stake than Paul did per se. She was pregnant with her daughter, something ended up happening that could affect her daughter. She had to make sure that she was staying true to what she was trained in with regards to the Bene Gesserit, and she actually fulfills a role within the Fremen that was very sacred. And I just found her a really interesting character. You don't see a lot of like mother characters in books that are made out to be super, super strong and such a vital part of the plot and are still like interesting. And Frank Herbert did a really good job with that. So now I'm going to go on to the things that I didn't like. And some of these aren't necessarily things that I didn't like. They're just things that didn't work for me personally as a reader. And this might be different for you. All of us are different readers and literature is subjective. So the first thing I want to talk about is Frank Herbert's prose. I personally was not a fan of his prose. I find it to be extremely dry. And I think that was part of my problem when I first read it because I found myself very, very bored. And the first half of this book is very slow, very boring. And I even listened to part of this on audio. And the audiobook production is top notch. It's a full cast. They have sound effects, everything. And I still found myself wandering, my mind wandering, listening to the audiobook. So I couldn't get into this book physically reading it and listening to it on audio, so both mediums. And eventually I just realized like I'm just not engaged with his prose. So I just found it very straightforward, very dry, not a lot of imagery, not a lot of figurative language, nothing to really create in my head good pictures of what he was trying to describe. Another thing I wasn't a fan of was the third person omniscient point of view. And the reason is because this book deals so heavily in inner monologue and inner thought processes. And we would be reading from one character's point of view and we are in their head, listening to their thoughts. And then suddenly we're jumping to another character. We're in their head, listening to their thoughts. And I just found it a bit discombobulated. And not only that, but a lot of times we're in the head of these characters and they're explaining to the reader what exactly they're going to do. And I feel like Frank Herbert could have just used like indirect characterization. You know, trust your readers. We know how to infer. We can tell about a character based on what they think, what they say, how they act. We can figure it out. You don't have to take us by the hand and guide us step by step through what your characters are planning to do. So the writing for me, I felt like could have just been scaled down a little bit if he had just not focused so much on holding the reader's hand and also jumping around so much between the different characters' thoughts. I will say that I did enjoy the second half of this book way more than the first. The first half of this book is a lot of backstory, history, political intrigue, and I struggled with the first half a lot more than the second half. So once we get into the desert with the Fremen and we are seeing the kind of fulfillment of prophecy with Paul, that was definitely more engaging for me personally. Another thing I just want to mention is how low action this book is. This wasn't necessarily a good or bad thing for me. So when you think about like, I don't know, science fiction, space opera, like The Expanse by James S. A. Corey, you think like a lot of action. And for a story about a planet whose people are rising up to fight their oppressors, you would think there would be a lot of action. And there is a little bit thrown in here and there, a couple of scenes, but overall this book is not action packed. It is way more slow burn, build up the story, a lot of politics rather than action. And another thing I didn't really like about this book was the hero trope that Frank Herbert used for Paul. So I personally did not find Paul to be an interesting character at all. I felt like he wasn't fleshed out. I feel like he didn't have his own personality. He kind of just fit into the pre-made mold that Frank Herbert set for him. And I felt like he was perfect. He didn't have any flaws. He fulfilled every prophecy that was said about him, and he really was boring to me personally. Now, what I will say is interesting about Paul is not Paul himself, but kind of the way that he came to be. So we have the Bene Gesserit that are basically trying to create this prophet. They have been working at that for decades, centuries even maybe. And the fact that they were able to create someone to fulfill a prophecy kind of negates the whole fact that it was a prophecy. Like Paul is basically just fulfilling something that already was set for him. And he was like 15 years old. So by the way, all of you guys that say that YA is crappy because teenagers go around saving the world, Paul's like 15 at the beginning of this book, and 2 years pass, and he's 17. So you can't say anything. Anyway, so we have this teenager that is basically saving the world, saving these people, and at the end of the book ascends to like a higher political position. So I have read a lot of reviews that say that Paul falls into like the savior trope, and I definitely see that. But then I've also heard that the rest of the Dune books kind of break down this whole savior trope to show why selective breeding, why kind of Paul's ascension, his creation to fulfill this construct, actually was a bad thing instead of letting just things happen naturally. And that concept is really, really interesting to me. But I just feel like that's a very clever idea to create this protagonist, this hero, this savior, who in subsequent books we show his downfall. So if that actually is the truth and that actually happens in the rest of the books, you guys let me know, because that alone might compel me to read the rest of these books. And I found it interesting, the whole Bene Gesserit thing. I kind of wish that Frank Herbert had gone more into detail with it, because I would love to learn more about them, because you have this kind of sect of women that are very powerful, and they are taught this very kind of ancient magic almost, and their maneuverings affect the entire empire. I felt like their only role, even though they were so powerful and had all these cool mental abilities and their ability to manipulate people, I felt like it wasn't used to the advantage that it could have in the story, because all they do is selective breed in order to create certain people. Like what's the point of having all of these abilities if all you're doing is breeding? Like, it doesn't help you, it doesn't matter. So it just didn't make sense that he created this group of women and then that was their function. So I just felt like those two concepts were a little off kilter. And finally, once again, this is not a like or a dislike, but we don't really have any romance in this book, so I don't need romance in my books in order for it to be good, but I just want to say there's really none in this book. However, there is insta-love, and once again, for all you people that hate on young adult because there's insta-love, Paul Cheney. Man, like just nothing, and they're like in love, married, boom, 2 years later we have a kid together. And I feel like Cheney could have been a really cool character, but I didn't really feel like she was developed enough either. She's just Paul's lover, the mother of his child. In this world they don't have like monogamy either with the Fremen or in like the Empire. So I don't know why, because Frank Herbert was an American author, you know, and I know a lot of cultures like practice polygamy, but it's not an idea that's perpetuated in like Western culture. So it's just interesting that Frank Herbert did, because not only was it in like the indigenous population that could have a different culture, but it's like all of the dukes, you know, have like a wife and then concubines. So not an idea that I was totally on board with. I could have seen if it was like a cultural thing with like, you know, the Fremen, but then like the fact that it was just everywhere, just I wasn't a fan of that idea. So yeah, we have insta-love between Paul and then Cheney, and then Paul ends up getting married at the end of the book anyway. So just no romance really, just kind of a lot of polygamy. Anyway, you guys, so those are just a few things that I liked and I didn't like about Dune. So would I recommend Dune? So I really think you have to go into this book knowing that it was written in 1965, and I can definitely see the influences of Dune in current works, and I appreciate that. I really do. Did I love it? I did not. I did not love the writing. I enjoyed the world. I did not love the characters. I feel like it's mostly a book to stimulate discussion and ideas, and it's not one that you would go in looking for like a great time and lovable characters, awesome plot. However, I do respect it for what it is. I respect what it brings to the science fiction genre. And am I glad I read it? Yes, yes I am. I don't know if I'm going to continue with the rest of the series just because I did not love Dune that much. So you guys will have to let me know in the comments if it's a series that you think I should personally continue. I do not recommend this book if you are just getting into science fiction. And I think that was my problem when I first read it, is I was not a science fiction reader. So I don't recommend it if you are new to sci-fi, but if you are someone who is interested in studying like the classical science fiction authors, or someone that is a more seasoned sci-fi reader, I would recommend Dune. It's just, for me, not a new favorite, but like I said, I am glad that I read it. Okay, you guys, so that is it for my review of Dune. Let me know in the comments if you have read this and what you thought of it, and I will see y'all in another video soon. Goodbye!